To conclude my examinations of Ignatius of Antioch, I would like to refer to a topic that is often cited by Roman Catholic apologists in an effort to discredit the Protestant view of Ignatius. And that is to suggest that John Calvin, the great Protestant reformer, rejected the letters of Ignatius on the grounds that he was too strong of an advocate for Roman Catholic doctrines such as the Episcopal Church government structure or the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. As I've pointed out in previous videos, neither of these points are problematic at all for Protestants to accept, and in this video I hope to demonstrate that no, John Calvin did not reject Ignatius because he was too Roman Catholic. There are two quotations that are often cited to demonstrate that John Calvin rejected the letters of Ignatius, and the more prominent of the two is found in his magnum opus, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, specifically Book 1, Chapter 13, Paragraph 29, where John Calvin says the following: "With regard to what they pretend as to Ignatius, if they would have it to be of the least importance, let them prove that the apostles enacted laws concerning Lent and other corruptions. Nothing can be more nauseating than the absurdities which have been published under the name of Ignatius, and therefore the conduct of those who provide themselves with such masks for deception is the less entitled to toleration." Now again, the allegation here is that John Calvin rejected all of Ignatius's letters because they were heavily advocating for Roman Catholic doctrines. However, we must ask ourselves, what is the context in which John Calvin is writing when he says this quotation? Because if we take this quotation out of its original context, then we lose the reason why John Calvin cites Ignatius in the first place. And so let's ask ourselves, what is the context in which John Calvin writes this? Well, Book 1, Chapter 13 of the Institutes of the Christian Religion is primarily concerned about teaching the doctrine of the Trinity. The title of the chapter is literally called Unity of the Divine Essence in Three Persons, Taught in Scripture Before the Foundation of the World. And in the last three paragraphs of this chapter, John Calvin actually cites a number of church fathers to prove and demonstrate that they themselves taught the doctrine of the Trinity and upheld the deity of Christ. For example, in paragraph 27, John Calvin cites Irenaeus of Lyon as an example of someone who taught the deity of Christ. In the very next paragraph, paragraph 28, he cites Tertullian as another figure who taught the deity of Christ. And in the last paragraph of this chapter, he cites once again Irenaeus, he cites Justin Martyr, and Hilary, all as examples of church fathers who taught the deity of Christ. Now, the reason he brings up all these church fathers is because Arian heretics, and by Arian I mean those who reject the divinity of Christ, Arian heretics are trying to suggest that all of these church fathers denied the deity of Christ. And as a response, John Calvin cites passages from all of these church fathers demonstrating exactly the opposite, that in reality, yes, they actually did teach that Jesus Christ is God. This ultimately is what leads us to the quote that we're looking at here regarding Ignatius. Because the Arian heretics are using Ignatius, just like they did with the other church fathers, to try and demonstrate that Ignatius of Antioch denied the divinity of Christ. And the response that John Calvin gives to this is to appeal to another false doctrine that is supposedly taught by Ignatius, and that is the laws concerning Lent. Calvin is essentially saying that if the Arians are so willing to deny the divinity of Christ because it is supposedly taught by Ignatius, then they likewise should be willing to accept the laws concerning Lent because that is also taught by Ignatius. But the reality of the situation is that laws concerning Lent are not apostolic doctrines because they are not confirmed by the Word of God. We see this in examples such as Romans chapter 14, for example, and other places like Colossians, where the Apostle Paul acknowledges that it is totally permissible for Christians to have various dietary habits so long as they are not harming the faith of another brother. And so therefore, appealing to Ignatius as an example of a figure teaching such doctrines is absurd. What is absolutely extraordinary about this situation is that the passage from quote-unquote Ignatius that John Calvin appeals to suggest that he taught laws concerning Lent is a passage that comes from a forgery. In Ignatius's letter to the Philippians, chapter 13, he writes that we ought not despise the period of 40 days, for it comprises an imitation of the conduct of the Lord. But as we've examined here, Ignatius only has 7 genuine epistles that have been attributed to him. That is the consensus among scholars today. And the letter to the Philippians, written in the name of Ignatius, is not among those 7. It is vitally important to understand that the list of writings that have been attributed to Ignatius throughout the history of the church is a list that has been highly doctored, and there historically has been great debate as to which of these writings was genuinely written by Ignatius and which of them were actually forgeries. As we've covered in my various videos here on Ignatius, scholarly consensus today recognizes that there are 7 genuine letters that were written by Ignatius and attributed to him. However, there are also up to at least 8 other letters that have been attributed to Ignatius that scholarly consensus today rejects as forgeries that were not written by Ignatius. And one of those forgeries is this letter to the Philippians that includes a commandment to observe laws concerning Lent. And as it relates to the greater context of this chapter from the Institutes, these false letters from Ignatius not only teach laws concerning Lent, but they also reject the divinity of Christ. This is the reason why John Calvin rejects the so-called letters from Ignatius. Not because they teach the Episcopalian structure of church government, not because they teach the real presence of Christ, but because they're teaching Arianism and laws concerning Lent. And wouldn't you know, both of these topics that Ignatius supposedly teaches are found in forgeries that were not written by Ignatius. It's also worth pointing out that in the genuine letters that Ignatius did write, he very clearly affirmed the deity of Christ. There are many examples of this, but one such example comes from the very first verse of his letter to the Smyrnians, which we've already examined. The very first words he says is, "I give glory to Jesus Christ, the God who has made you so wise." In another passage from his letter to Polycarp, chapter 8, verse 3, he says, "I bid you farewell always in our God, Jesus Christ." So John Calvin maintains that if the Arians want to prove that Arianism is an apostolic doctrine, then they should likewise try to prove that laws concerning Lent is an apostolic doctrine. But because neither of these doctrines are apostolic in nature, it only further proves the absurdities of their heresy, which is exactly what he goes on to talk about in his passage from the Institutes, where he says that nothing can be more nauseating than the absurdities which have been published under the name of Ignatius. These absurdities are not the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist or Episcopalianism. These absurdities are Arianism and laws concerning Lent. I'd also like you to notice the precise language that John Calvin uses. He says nothing can be more nauseating than the absurdities which have been published under the name of Ignatius. This language does not at all refer to all of Ignatius's writings, nor does it refer to all of the writings of Ignatius that are actually genuine. John Calvin could have just been merely referring to those letters that were known forgeries that did teach these heretical doctrines that he has been laboring on. To conclude our examination of this quote, we can acknowledge that John Calvin rejected Ignatius not on the grounds of him being too Roman Catholic, but on the grounds of Ignatius not holding to apostolic doctrine, namely the divinity of Christ. The second quote that is referenced to suggest that John Calvin rejected Ignatius is found in his commentary on Philippians chapter 4, verse 3. Now we're going to take a look at this commentary again to see the greater context in which John Calvin is writing to demonstrate, no, John Calvin did not reject Ignatius on the grounds of him being too Roman Catholic. The primary argument that John Calvin is outlining in this commentary is to suggest that the Apostle Paul did not have a wife. We can acknowledge that John Calvin is not debating the monoepiscopacy or the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. What he's debating is whether or not the Apostle Paul had a wife, and he cites Erasmus as an example of a person who does suggest the Apostle Paul had a wife, a view that Calvin disagrees with. As we move further along in this commentary, we see that John Calvin cites Ignatius as a church father that his opponents bring up to support their view that the Apostle Paul had a wife. People who disagree with Calvin quote Ignatius and Clement of Alexandria specifically as supports for their view. Now, notice here, John Calvin acknowledges that if the quotations are genuine, then he would respect them. And the reason why he would respect them is because he regards Ignatius and Clement as men of such eminence. This demonstrates that John Calvin had great respect for Ignatius, contrary to what the Roman Catholic claims might otherwise be. It is in this next sentence where John Calvin explains why he rejects the opinions of Ignatius and Clement of Alexandria on this specific point. The reason why Calvin rejects these quotes from Ignatius in particular is because they come from questionable authenticity. He does not reject them because of his lack of respect for Ignatius, because as we just saw in the previous sentence, he greatly admires Ignatius. The basic point is that John Calvin acknowledges Ignatius as a godly man, but he doubts the authenticity of the writings that are attributed to him. He doubts their authenticity because of their spurious transmission, specifically on the part of Eusebius. Once again, he does not doubt them because of their teaching. Remember, the point of this commentary is to debate whether or not the Apostle Paul had a wife, not whether or not Christ is truly present in the Eucharist, for example. And what is absolutely extraordinary about this situation is that it is almost identical to the situation that we find in his quote from the Institutes. Because the specific quote that John Calvin refers to from Ignatius teaching that the Apostle Paul had a wife is also from a forgery. Calvin is referring to a quote from Ignatius' letter to the Philadelphians, chapter 4. And it is true that Ignatius' letter to the Philadelphians is a genuine epistle. But just as there were many forgeries added to the list of Ignatius' writings throughout church history, there are also many additions to the genuine letters of Ignatius that have been added throughout church history. Typically, the letters of Ignatius are categorized into three versions. There is a shorter rescission, a middle rescission, and a longer rescission. Scholars today, the consensus is that the longer rescission of these letters include additions to the text that were not genuinely written by Ignatius, and the shorter rescissions have taken some genuine aspects out. But the middle rescissions of Ignatius' letters are seen by the consensus of scholars to be the genuine Ignatian epistles. And so when I point out that John Calvin references Ignatius' letter to the Philadelphians, I have to clarify that this specific version of the letter to the Philadelphians is the longer rescission, which is seen as a forgery. In this version, it is true that quote-unquote Ignatius teaches that the Apostle Paul has a wife, but this longer rescission of Ignatius' letter is a forgery, and Ignatius himself did not write this quote. This shows that, at least as it relates to the point Calvin is addressing, the Apostle Paul not having a wife, John Calvin was correct to reject the authenticity of this citation of Ignatius, because history has since proven that this quotation comes from a forgery. Now, one might question why John Calvin also rejected Clement of Alexandria's quote on this matter, because the quote from Clement of Alexandria does come from a work called the Stromata, which is seen as a genuine work of his. And I will readily admit that I am nowhere near as knowledgeable about the writings of Clement of Alexandria as I am with Ignatius. But what I can say is that even if John Calvin was wrong to reject Clement of Alexandria on this matter, it's not on the basis of what he taught, it's on the basis of a question of authentic transmission. And as we've seen in the case of the quote attributed to Ignatius, John Calvin had a very good right to do so. And we can see further proof of this as well regarding Clement, because John Calvin himself regards Clement as a man of such eminence, much like Ignatius of Antioch. So as we can see from these two quotations, John Calvin rejected Ignatius not because Ignatius taught a mono-episcopal form of church government or the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, but the reason John Calvin rejected Ignatius is because Ignatius denied the divinity of Christ, commanded laws concerning Lent, and taught that the Apostle Paul had a wife. And it turns out that all three of these doctrines from Ignatius actually come from forgeries that Ignatius never wrote. And as it relates to the two doctrines that supposedly teach Roman Catholicism, we can see that in reality, John Calvin doesn't have a problem with either of them. For example, in his Institutes of the Christian Religion, Book 4, Chapter 17, Paragraph 19, John Calvin explicitly affirms that the Lord Jesus Christ is truly present in the Lord's Supper, a view that is synonymous with both Ignatius of Antioch and I myself as a 21st century Presbyterian. And regarding the topic of Episcopalian church government, while it is true that John Calvin affirmed Presbyterianism as the apostolic form of church government, he didn't outright reject and deny Episcopalianism in the way that we would expect if he was so adamantly against these doctrines from Ignatius of Antioch. As a last point on this topic, it is fair to admit that many church historians have affirmed that John Calvin rejected not only the forgeries attributed to Ignatius, but that John Calvin also rejected all of Ignatius's writings, including the genuine ones. An example of this is found in Philip Schaff, where he admits that John Calvin rejected all of the Ignatian epistles, and later Catholics surrendered at least 8 as utterly untenable. As we have seen in the quotations from Calvin himself, there is no explicit reason why we have to affirm that John Calvin rejected all of the epistles of Ignatius. But even if we concede and admit that John Calvin did reject all of Ignatius's writings, we can still affirm that he had a very good reason to do so given the context of the time period that he lived in. Let's take a look at Philip Schaff's quote again to get better context on this situation. Philip Schaff acknowledges that there are 7 genuine epistles of Ignatius with 8 additional forgeries. But the history of all of these epistles is sketchy and questionable at best. For example, he lists that 4 of these letters were published in Latin at Paris in 1495, but 11 more were published in Paris in 1498. Remember, there are only 7 genuine letters of Ignatius, so the fact that 15 supposed letters of Ignatius were published between the years of 1495 and 1498, again, is questionable. Philip Schaff goes on to record that all 15 of these letters were published in Greek in 1557, which would have been 6 years before John Calvin's death. And 12 of them were published again in 1560. All of this is to demonstrate that the history of the publishing of Ignatius's letters, as I've said twice already, was highly questionable. That there was no good reason for anybody during the time period of John Calvin to just blindly accept that all of these epistles were genuine, when it is very clear, now that we know today in the 21st century, that 8 of them were forgeries. And again, I will point out that as it relates to the 3 points of doctrine that John Calvin specifically rejected as having been written by Ignatius, he happened to be correct in all 3 cases, that all 3 of them came from Ignatian forgeries. So to conclude all of this, even if we were to concede and admit that John Calvin rejected all of the Ignatian epistles, including the genuine ones, we can likewise affirm that he did not do so without reasonable cause. As we can see from the time period of John Calvin's life, there was great debate and high skepticism about which of these writings were truly written by Ignatius and which ones were not. And this debate would not be resolved until centuries later after his death. Likewise, we can acknowledge that even if John Calvin rejected all of the genuine Ignatian epistles, he did not do so because they were too supportive of Roman Catholic claims. If anything, he rejected them because of false doctrines that were proved to have been from forgeries, and that the claims that are made by Roman Catholics to support their specific positions are claims that John Calvin likewise affirms without having to embrace Roman Catholicism.